James Anderson pushed open the heavy glass doors of Grand Trust Bank, the city's most prestigious financial institution. The bank's sleek marble floors gleamed under the artificial lighting, reflecting the grand chandeliers hanging from the ceiling. The scent of polished wood and freshly brewed coffee filled the air as well-dressed customers waited in line or lounged in plush chairs, sipping expensive lattes while discussing investments and business deals. James stood at the entrance for a moment, adjusting the worn straps of his large canvas bag, which bulged at odd angles. His clothes were faded and slightly wrinkled, a pair of old khaki pants, a simple plaid button-up, and a jacket that had seen better days. His sneakers were scuffed, their soles barely holding together. At first glance, he looked like any other elderly man struggling to get by in the fast-paced city. He stepped forward, the soft dragging of his bag against the floor disrupting the quiet murmurs of the bank. Heads turned, brows furrowed. A well-dressed woman in high heels and an elegant suit wrinkled her nose as she took a step back. A younger man in a tailored jacket glanced at James, then leaned toward his companion. "Did security just let anyone in here these days?" he muttered. James ignored the stares and made his way toward the teller's counter. As he approached, a young bank employee named Ethan Miller, who had been flipping through documents, looked up and immediately frowned. Ethan was in his late 20s, sharply dressed in a navy blue suit with a crisp white shirt and a gold name tag pinned neatly to his lapel. He had spent years climbing the corporate ladder, determined to make a name for himself in the financial industry. The last thing he needed was a ragged old man holding up the line. "Sir, I think you're in the wrong place," Ethan said, forcing a tight-lipped smile. James stopped in front of the counter, setting his heavy bag down with a soft thud. "No, I'm exactly where I need to be," he said calmly. Ethan's eyes flicked toward the bag before returning to James's face. "Are you here to open an account?" His voice held barely concealed skepticism. "Yes, I'd like to make a deposit." Ethan let out a short chuckle. "Sir, this is Grand Trust Bank. We don't deal with pocket change." The conversation had begun to attract attention. A few customers turned their heads, watching with mild amusement. A group of bank employees standing near the back exchanged glances, whispering among themselves. James remained unfazed. He slowly knelt down, gripping the bag's straps, and began to pull it open. "I think you should check what's inside before making any assumptions," he said. Ethan leaned forward slightly, his smirk still in place, though there was now a hint of curiosity in his eyes. "All right, let's see it then." James reached into the bag and pulled out a tightly wrapped stack of bills. The bundle was thick, held together by rubber bands, and consisted of worn $1 and $5 notes. He placed it on the counter. Then he reached in again. Another stack followed. Then another, and another. A hushed silence fell over the surrounding area as more people began to notice what was happening. The sheer volume of cash was growing at an astonishing rate, forming small piles on the marble countertop. Ethan's smirk began to waver. His fingers twitched slightly as he reached for one of the bundles. He glanced at the teller next to him, Sarah Bennett, who was now watching with wide eyes. This is a lot of money," she murmured under her breath. Ethan cleared his throat and turned back to James. "Sir, where exactly did you get all this cash?" His tone had shifted from condescension to unease. "I earned it," James replied simply. Ethan exchanged another glance with Sarah, then sighed. "Look, handling this much cash, especially in small denominations, is highly unusual. We'll need to verify its source before proceeding with any deposit." "I understand," James said. He remained patient, his expression unreadable. Ethan hesitated before nodding. "Fine, I'll call the manager." He turned and walked toward a glass-walled office at the far end of the bank, where the branch manager, Richard Coleman, was seated. As Ethan disappeared inside, a murmur spread through the bank. Customers whispered among themselves. Some peered over their shoulders, curious about the old man who had walked in looking like a beggar but was now stacking money like a businessman closing a deal. Victoria Hayes, the elegantly dressed woman who had sneered at James earlier, scoffed. "What a waste of time," she muttered, shaking her head. "All this fuss over what? A few $1,000s in crumpled bills." A young man sitting nearby smirked. "Maybe he robbed a convenience store $1 at a time." James heard every word but didn't react. He had been judged before. He had been underestimated before. And he knew that today, just like in all those moments past, The truth would speak for itself. Inside the office, Ethan stood stiffly in front of Richard Coleman's desk. The manager was a man in his 50s with salt and pepper hair, a neatly pressed suit, and an air of authority that kept his employees on edge. "Sir," Ethan began hesitantly, "we have a situation." Richard arched an eyebrow. "Situation?" "There's an old man at the counter trying to deposit an unusually large amount of cash, all in small bills." Richard frowned. "How much are we talking?" "I don't know yet, but it's a lot." Richard pushed back his chair and stood. "All right, let's see what's going on." As they exited the office, the atmosphere in the bank had shifted. The customers were no longer just glancing at James. They were openly staring. Even the security guard near the entrance had moved a few steps closer, his hand hovering near his radio. Richard approached the counter, taking in the sight of the old man, the worn-out bag, and the stacks of cash. His lips pressed into a thin line. "What's going on here?" he demanded. Ethan quickly summarized the situation, gesturing toward the growing piles of money. Richard folded his arms and studied James carefully. "Sir, I'll be blunt. This is an unusual way to deposit money. We have procedures in place for large cash transactions, and frankly, your circumstances raise a few concerns." James met his gaze steadily. "What concerns?" Richard exhaled sharply. "We need to know the source of this money. And quite frankly, carrying this much cash in a bag like this, it's suspicious. Are you sure you haven't come across this money in a way that might require legal intervention?" A quiet ripple of laughter passed through the customers nearby. James remained unmoved. Then, in a voice as steady as ever, he said, "I've worked hard for every dollar here. If you don't believe me, I'm happy to wait for someone with the authority to process my request." Richard hesitated. The murmur in the room had shifted. Some customers were still skeptical, but others were beginning to wonder. Who was this old man? And why did he seem so sure of himself? What happened next would be something none of them would ever forget. Richard Coleman's sharp eyes remained locked onto James Anderson, trying to gauge whether the elderly man was bluffing. The growing stacks of money on the counter were impossible to ignore. Even the most seasoned bankers didn't see this much cash in small denominations all at once. Despite James's calm demeanor, Richard wasn't convinced. His years in the banking industry had taught him one thing. When something seemed unusual, it usually was. A man like James, dressed like a street wanderer, dragging a bag of wrinkled cash, didn't fit the profile of someone making a legitimate multi-million-dollar deposit. The bank's clientele had also taken notice. Customers whispered in hushed tones, some watching with amusement, others with suspicion. A few employees exchanged skeptical glances, their postures stiff with silent judgment. Ethan, still standing beside Richard, folded his arms and smirked slightly. "Sir," he said, addressing James with measured patience, "you say this is your money, but large cash transactions like this require verification. Do you have any bank statements, records, or documents to prove where this money came from?" James remained unfazed. He reached into the inner pocket of his worn-out jacket and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook. He placed it gently on the counter and slid it toward Ethan. "It's all in there," he said simply. Ethan hesitated before picking up the book. He flipped it open, his brow furrowing. The pages were filled with handwritten entries, neat and meticulous, documenting every single dollar James had saved over the years. Each entry listed the date, the amount, and sometimes a short note beside it. $12.75, collected bottles and cans. $8.50, sold old newspapers. $25, winning lottery ticket. $50, handyman work for Mrs. Palmer. The book was a testament to a lifetime of labor, an undeniable record of a man who had earned his wealth penny by penny. Sarah, the other teller, leaned in slightly to get a better look. For the first time since the conversation started, there was no hint of condescension in her expression. In fact, there was something resembling admiration. Still, Ethan wasn't convinced. "Handwritten notes don't count as official proof, Mr. Anderson," he said, placing the book back on the counter. James let out a small sigh. He had expected this reaction. Richard, growing impatient, tapped his fingers against the glass countertop. "All right," he said. "I'm going to need to make a few calls. But until then, I can't allow this transaction to proceed." James met his gaze steadily. "Then I'll wait." There was something in the way he said it, firm yet polite, unshaken by the increasing hostility around him. Richard nodded at the security guard near the entrance. The man stepped closer, not making any overtly aggressive moves, but clearly ready to escort James out if necessary. At this moment, another customer, a young man in a tailored navy suit, let out a soft chuckle from the waiting area. "This is ridiculous," he muttered just loud enough for people to hear. "I have a meeting in 15 minutes, and we're wasting time on a guy who looks like he just walked out of a soup kitchen." A few others laughed under their breath. Victoria Hayes, the well-dressed woman who had scoffed earlier, chimed in. "Honestly, why are we even entertaining this?" She looked at James, her arms crossed. "Mister, if you're trying to scam your way into a bank account, you could have at least come up with a better backstory." David Carter, the young teller who had remained silent so far, finally had enough. He turned toward Victoria, his usually reserved expression now firm. "Miss, with all due respect, how about we let the man prove himself before passing judgment?" Victoria's eyebrows shot up. "Oh, and what makes you think he's telling the truth?" David turned to James, his voice steady. "Because I believe in giving people a chance." A tense silence fell between them. Victoria scoffed, but didn't reply. Richard, sensing the shift in atmosphere, exhaled sharply. "Enough," he snapped. "I'll make the calls and get a decision soon." He turned to Ethan. "In the meantime, get a counting machine ready. If he's telling the truth, we're going to need to verify the amount." Ethan didn't look pleased but obeyed. He retrieved a bill counter from the back, while Sarah hesitated before offering James a slight nod, perhaps a small acknowledgement that things were finally being handled fairly. The waiting game began. Some customers grew frustrated, grumbling as they checked their watches. Others stayed to watch, intrigued by the unfolding drama. James stood there patiently, unfazed by the cold treatment. Minutes passed. Richard disappeared into his office, presumably making phone calls to legal advisors or upper management. The security guard remained nearby, still eyeing James cautiously. David, unable to shake his curiosity, finally spoke again. "Mr. Anderson, if you don't mind me asking, how long have you been saving this money?" James turned to him, his eyes warm but thoughtful. "A long time," he admitted. "Started when I was just a kid, picking up odd jobs. My mother always told me, save every penny, because no one else will save it for you. I took that advice to heart." David nodded, genuinely impressed. "And all of this? It's from years of hard work." James smiled slightly. "Every dollar." The young teller's respect for the man deepened. Meanwhile, Ethan returned with the bill counter, setting it on the counter with a loud thud. "All right," he muttered. "Let's see how much we're dealing with." The process began. Stack by stack, the cash was fed into the machine, the numbers ticking upward on the screen. At first, no one paid much attention. But then the numbers kept rising. $50,000. $100,000. $250,000. The murmurs in the room grew louder. $500,000. $800,000. Even Richard, who had just returned from his office, stopped in his tracks. Ethan's smirk had long disappeared. The tension in the air was no longer one of amusement, but of shock. By the time the count hit $1 million, the bank was completely silent. Victoria Hayes, who had been one of the loudest critics, now looked visibly uncomfortable. The young man in the navy suit, who had mocked James earlier, shifted in his chair, suddenly finding his phone very interesting. James remained where he stood, calm as ever. Ethan swallowed hard and glanced at Richard. "Sir, we're past $1 million." Richard rubbed his temples, realizing just how big of a mistake he had made. And the count wasn't even finished yet. For the first time since James had stepped into the bank, the balance of power had shifted. The man they had dismissed as a nobody was about to teach them all a lesson they would never forget. A network error occurred. Please check your connection and try again. If this issue persists, please contact us through our help center at help.openai.com. The rhythmic hum of the bill counter filled the silent bank lobby. Each time a stack of cash passed through, the digital screen flickered, climbing higher and higher. $1.2 million. $1.5 million. The weight of the moment settled over everyone. The once dismissive whispers had disappeared, replaced by stunned silence. Even Victoria Hayes, who had been quick to mock James, was now clutching her designer handbag a little tighter, her perfectly shaped eyebrows furrowing in disbelief. Ethan Miller, who had been so eager to brush James aside, could no longer mask his unease. His fingers tapped restlessly on the counter as he watched the numbers climb. This has to be a mistake, he mumbled under his breath. Sarah Bennett, the other teller, had initially treated James with the same skepticism, but now she was struggling to process the reality before her. She adjusted her glasses, looking from James to the ever-growing total. "It's all legitimate," she muttered. James, meanwhile, stood quietly, hands folded in front of him, his expression unreadable. His patience never wavered. He had been here before, judged, dismissed, treated like less than he was. He had expected this reaction. David Carter, the young teller who had defended James from the start, felt a strange mix of satisfaction and concern. He had believed the old man deserved a fair chance, but even he hadn't anticipated a fortune of this magnitude. Then the count passed $2 million. Richard Coleman, the bank manager, inhaled sharply. He had been watching from the side, arms crossed, his expression carefully controlled. But now, as the numbers edged closer to figures that could no longer be ignored, his professionalism began to waver. James noticed. He turned his head slightly toward Richard, his voice as steady as ever. "Still think I shouldn't be here?" Richard stiffened but didn't respond. The final numbers settled. $3.5 million. The moment hung in the air like a thunderclap. No one spoke. No one even breathed. Ethan, who had spent the past hour treating James as a nuisance, felt the blood drain from his face. The other customers, some of whom had laughed at the old man earlier, now sat rigid in their seats. A few exchanged guilty glances, realizing just how wrong they had been. Victoria, who had sneered at James's presence, was gripping the strap of her purse so tightly her knuckles had turned white. One of the businessmen who had mocked James earlier finally found his voice. How is this possible?" he stammered. James didn't look at him. Instead, he slowly reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the worn notebook he had shown Ethan before. With deliberate movements, he placed it back on the counter and opened it to the first page. "This," he said, his voice quiet but firm, "is 50 years of my life." The room remained silent. Even the security guard, who had been standing nearby in case things escalated, now looked unsure of what to do. "I've been working since I was a boy," James continued. "I never made much, but I saved every penny I could. I didn't buy fancy clothes. I didn't take vacations. I didn't waste what I earned." He tapped a calloused finger against the pages of his notebook. "Every dollar here was worked for, earned, saved." David, still standing near the counter, swallowed hard. He had grown up in a world of credit cards and digital banking. The idea of someone physically saving millions in cash over decades was almost incomprehensible. Richard, who had been rigid with discomfort, suddenly stepped forward. "Mr. Anderson," he said, his voice carefully measured, "I apologize if we've misjudged the situation. Given the amount of cash, there are certain procedures." James held up a hand, stopping him. "I'm not angry," he said simply. "I expected this. I've spent my whole life being underestimated." Victoria let out a nervous chuckle, though it lacked the arrogance she had before. "I mean, you have to admit, it's not every day someone like you walks in here with that kind of money." James turned his head toward her, his sharp blue eyes locking onto hers. "Someone like me?" he repeated. Victoria's face flushed. She quickly looked away. James exhaled, a slow, deliberate sigh. "You all think wealth looks a certain way," he said. "You see a man in an expensive suit, and you assume he's important. You see someone like me, and you assume I'm nothing." Ethan flinched as though James's words had struck him like a blow. James shook his head. "But money doesn't define a person. Character does." Richard cleared his throat. "Mr. Anderson, of course, we recognize that now. And I assure you, your deposit will be handled with the utmost professionalism." James nodded. "I appreciate that." For the first time since he had stepped into the bank, he saw something shift in Richard's expression. A sliver of respect. Ethan, on the other hand, looked like he wanted to disappear. David, glancing between them, finally spoke. "Mr. Anderson, how would you like to proceed with your deposit?" James glanced at the piles of cash, then back at David. "I'd like to open a savings account." David smiled. "Of course, sir. Let me handle that for you." As he began the process, James's posture remained as steady as ever. But then the front doors of the bank swung open. A man in a dark gray suit strode in, his polished shoes clicking against the floor. He was tall, confident, and exuded authority. Several customers turned to look, recognizing him immediately. Ethan's jaw nearly dropped. Even Richard looked surprised. The man's gaze swept across the room before landing on James. Then, to everyone's astonishment, he smiled. And then, in a voice loud enough for the entire room to hear, he said, "Dad." The bank fell into stunned silence. David blinked. Sarah gasped. Ethan's face turned a shade paler than before. James, completely unfazed, returned the smile. Michael, the man, Michael Anderson, walked straight toward his father and pulled him into a brief but firm hug. At that moment, Richard's posture stiffened. He had heard the name Michael Anderson before. So had nearly everyone in the bank. Because Michael Anderson wasn't just anyone. He was the CEO of Anderson Enterprises, one of the largest and most successful real estate firms in the country. A billionaire. The room, already tense from the revelation of James's wealth, erupted into chaos. Customers whispered in disbelief. Employees exchanged panicked glances. Ethan's entire body seemed to lock up as the realization sank in. Victoria Hayes, the same woman who had scoffed at James earlier, looked absolutely mortified. Richard, who had just moments ago been treating James as a nuisance, suddenly felt an overwhelming sense of regret. Michael, still holding his father's shoulder, looked around the room, his expression unreadable. Then, with quiet authority, he said, "Who here treated my father with disrespect?" The bank froze. James, ever the patient man, simply sighed. And at that moment, everyone in Grand Trust Bank knew. They had made a terrible mistake. Silence clamped down on Grand Trust Bank like a heavy fog. Michael Anderson's words hung in the air, thick with unspoken consequences. No one dared to move. Ethan Miller, whose arrogance had fueled much of the mistreatment toward James, felt the weight of his own heartbeat pounding in his chest. His palms were damp. He stole a quick glance at Richard Coleman, the branch manager, but Richard himself looked like he had been struck by lightning. Victoria Hayes, the socialite who had been the first to sneer at James, shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting toward the exit as if she could somehow escape the suffocating embarrassment. The other customers, who had once laughed along, now sat rigid, their expressions trapped somewhere between shame and disbelief. Michael's gaze swept across the room, his piercing blue eyes assessing everyone who had been part of the unfolding debacle. Though his voice had been even, almost casual, the tension it carried was unmistakable. "Let me ask again," Michael said, taking a step closer to his father. "Who here treated my father with disrespect?" James exhaled softly, shaking his head. "Michael." But Michael held up a hand, cutting him off without breaking his gaze from the trembling bank employees. David Carter, the young teller who had stood up for James from the beginning, straightened his shoulders. His eyes darted between his colleagues, but he remained silent, unwilling to throw anyone under the bus. Though, frankly, most of them had already done that to themselves. Finally, Richard cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the situation. "Mr. Anderson," he said carefully, the authoritative edge in his voice slightly weakened. "There was a misunderstanding." Michael arched a brow. "A misunderstanding?" His voice remained dangerously calm. Richard nodded stiffly. "We had no way of knowing." Michael let out a dry chuckle, cutting him off. "Knowing what?" "That my father isn't someone to be dismissed." He shook his head in disappointment. "That he doesn't need to wear a $1,000 suit to deserve respect?" Richard's jaw tensed. He had spent years in the banking industry, building a reputation of control and composure. Yet now, he found himself utterly cornered. James finally spoke up, his voice as steady as ever. "Michael, that's enough." His son turned to him, incredulous. "Enough?" James sighed, rubbing his temples. "I didn't come here to cause a scene. I came here to deposit my money, just like any other customer. That's all." Michael studied his father for a long moment before nodding slowly. "All right." He turned back to Richard. "Then let's hear it. What's the next step?" "My father has $3.5 million in cash sitting on this counter. I assume you're going to do your job now." Richard hesitated, then nodded stiffly. "Yes, of course." He gestured toward Ethan. "Begin the deposit process." Ethan, who had been frozen in place, finally snapped into motion. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the paperwork, his mind racing through the humiliating realization that he had treated a multimillionaire like garbage. James, ever the patient man, observed the scene with a small shake of his head. "You know," he murmured, "it's funny." Michael turned to him. "What is?" James gestured to the room. "How quickly respect is given once people know how much money you have." The words landed like a slap. Victoria flinched. A few customers had the decency to look ashamed. Even Richard's lips pressed into a thin line, his discomfort evident. But Ethan looked like he had just swallowed glass. The young teller forced himself to meet James's gaze. For the first time, there was no arrogance, no smugness, only shame. "I was wrong," Ethan admitted quietly. James regarded him for a long moment, then gave a slow nod. "Yes, you were." Ethan swallowed hard. He looked at Michael, then back at James. "Mr. Anderson, I truly apologize." James tilted his head. "Are you sorry because of what you did? Or because of who I turned out to be?" Ethan opened his mouth, but no words came. Michael watched the exchange in silence, his expression unreadable. Then, after a moment, he turned to Richard. "And you?" Richard clenched his jaw. Unlike Ethan, he had spent decades mastering the art of corporate diplomacy. His voice was measured, but there was no denying the strain beneath it. "Mr. Anderson, I regret the way this was handled. That being said, Michael cut him off with a sharp wave of his hand. "Save it." Richard stiffened. "My father's too kind to make a big deal out of this," Michael continued. "But I'm not." His voice dropped slightly, laced with quiet authority. "Do you have any idea what kind of liability this is for you?" "For the bank." Richard's posture remained rigid. "I understand, Mr. Anderson." Michael's lips curled slightly, but there was no humor in his expression. "Do you?" He took a step forward. "Because from where I'm standing, this entire branch just humiliated one of its customers in front of a room full of people, because he didn't look the part." A visible shudder ran through Ethan's shoulders. Sarah, who had been silent throughout the exchange, bit her lip. Michael exhaled through his nose. "Here's what's going to happen," he said. 1. You're going to process my father's deposit immediately. 2. You're going to implement mandatory customer service training for every single employee in this branch. And 3. He turned slightly, his eyes locking onto Ethan. You're going to apologize again. Properly. Ethan hesitated, then stepped forward. He looked James in the eyes, no longer a cocky young banker, but a humbled man. "Mr. Anderson," he said, his voice steady but quiet. "I misjudged you. I was disrespectful, and I had no right to treat you the way I did." He swallowed, then added, "I hope you'll forgive me." James studied him for a long time before nodding once. "You'll learn from this," he said. "I hope the next person who walks in wearing an old jacket won't get the same treatment." Ethan nodded. "They won't." Michael, satisfied, turned back to Richard. "And you?" Richard hesitated, then gave a slow nod. "I'll see to it that policies are changed," he said. Michael smirked. "Good." With that, the tension finally began to lift. Employees scrambled to finalize James's deposit. The whispers among the customers died down. The security guard, realizing he was no longer needed, stepped back toward his usual post. James turned to his son. "Are we done here?" Michael chuckled. "For now." As James picked up his now empty canvas bag and turned toward the exit, the room seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. The lessons had been learned. The apologies had been made. And yet, as Michael followed his father out of the bank, he knew one thing for certain. No one inside Grand Trust Bank would ever forget the day they met James Anderson. James Anderson stepped out of Grand Trust Bank, the cool afternoon air brushing against his weathered face. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the busy street. Beside him, Michael adjusted his suit jacket, his expression still tight with lingering frustration. "They were lucky you didn't press charges," Michael muttered as they walked toward his parked black Mercedes. James let out a soft chuckle. "Press charges? For what?" "For the way they treated you," Michael said, running a hand through his neatly combed hair. "For dismissing you like you were a nobody. For humiliating you in front of a whole bank full of people." His voice carried an edge that hadn't quite dulled since the confrontation inside. James stopped walking and turned to face his son. "And what would that change?" he asked simply. Michael exhaled sharply. "It would make them accountable." James studied his son for a moment before shaking his head with a small smile. "You think forcing an apology changes what's in a person's heart?" Michael didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned his gaze back toward the bank's glass doors. where employees and customers still seemed to be buzzing over what had just happened. "They'll remember today," James continued, his voice steady. "That's enough." Michael sighed, knowing there was no arguing with his father when he spoke with that quiet certainty. "Fine, but at least let me take you to dinner. My treat." James chuckled again. "You mean with money I could have easily paid for myself?" Michael smirked. All right. Just humor me, old man." As they climbed into the car, the weight of the afternoon's events began to settle, but unbeknownst to both of them, the story was just beginning to spread. The story goes viral. The next morning, Grand Trust Bank's confrontation was everywhere. A young woman named Jessica Powell, a freelance journalist who had been sitting in the waiting area during the entire ordeal, had posted a detailed account of what happened on social media. Her post contained photos, quotes, and even a short video clip capturing the moment Michael Anderson revealed his relationship to James. Within hours, the post had been shared thousands of times. By noon, local news stations were running segments titled, "Elderly Man Mistaken for Homeless at Bank Turns Out to Be Millionaire." A $3.5 million lesson in respect. Bank faces backlash after humiliating senior citizen who just wanted to deposit his savings. The comments flooded in rapidly. This is exactly what's wrong with society. People judge others by appearance, not character. That old man has more dignity in his little finger than that entire bank staff combined. So inspiring. Imagine saving every dollar you earned through hard work and patience. Some were angry. The bank should be sued. Period. The employees should be fired. Why do people assume wealth only looks one way? Others were reflective. This made me rethink how I treat strangers. What if I've dismissed someone just because of how they looked? As the story gained traction, national news networks picked it up. By the end of the day, #JamesAnderson was trending on Twitter. Grand Trust Bank's corporate office, which had initially tried to stay silent, suddenly found itself in a public relations nightmare. Calls and emails flooded their customer service department, demanding accountability. The fallout at Grand Trust Bank. Inside the very branch where it all happened, the atmosphere was tense. Richard Coleman, the branch manager, sat stiffly in his office, his phone buzzing nonstop. A corporate executive had already scheduled a meeting with him later that afternoon, one that he was not looking forward to. Ethan Miller, the young teller who had been at the center of the controversy, was staring blankly at his screen, unable to focus. The weight of his actions was hitting him harder than ever. "Hey." Ethan turned to see David Carter standing by his desk. Unlike most people in the office, David didn't look at him with judgment, just quiet contemplation. "Rough morning?" David asked. Ethan let out a humorless laugh. "That's one way to put it." He ran a hand over his face. "I keep replaying it in my head. The way I talked to him. The way I treated him." David folded his arms. "What are you going to do about it?" Ethan looked up. "What do you mean?" "I mean, you made a mistake. The whole world saw it. But what happens next is up to you." Ethan swallowed hard. "You think I can fix it?" David shrugged. "I don't know, but I think the first step is trying." For the first time since the story broke, Ethan felt something other than dread. Hope. James Anderson's unexpected visitor. Later that evening, James sat in his small but tidy apartment, sipping a cup of tea while reading the newspaper. He wasn't much for technology, so he hadn't seen the firestorm unfolding online. A knock at his door interrupted the quiet. He set his cup down and got up, his knees aching slightly from years of hard labor. When he opened the door, he blinked in surprise. Standing there was Ethan Miller. The young man looked nothing like the arrogant teller from the day before. He was dressed more casually, without the stiffness of his banking attire. His posture wasn't cocky. It was uncertain, almost nervous. James raised an eyebrow. "Well, this is unexpected." Ethan exhaled. "Mr. Anderson, I came to apologize." James leaned against the doorframe, studying him. "Didn't you already do that?" Ethan shook his head. "Not properly. Not the way I should have." He hesitated before continuing. "I was wrong. I let my assumptions cloud my judgment. And I treated you in a way no person should ever be treated." He swallowed. "I just wanted you to know that I see that now. And I'm sorry." James considered him for a long moment before finally stepping aside. "Come in, kid." Ethan's eyes widened slightly in surprise, but he nodded and stepped inside. As James closed the door behind them, he knew one thing for certain. Not everyone learns their lesson, but some do. And sometimes, that's enough. James Anderson led Ethan Miller into his modest apartment, the soft creak of the wooden floor beneath them filling the silence. The place was small but well kept, with neatly arranged furniture and a faint scent of old books and coffee lingering in the air. Ethan hesitated just inside the doorway, unsure of whether he had earned the right to be there. The previous day, he had dismissed this man as if he were nothing. And now, after the storm of public backlash, he stood in the home of the very person he had wronged. James motioned to the small dining table in the corner. "Have a seat, kid." Ethan obeyed, feeling strangely out of place as he lowered himself onto one of the sturdy wooden chairs. He glanced around, noticing framed photos on a shelf, some old and faded, others newer, all capturing moments of a life he had assumed was insignificant. James poured 2 cups of tea, placing one in front of Ethan before taking a seat himself. He took a slow sip before finally speaking. "Why are you really here?" Ethan shifted uncomfortably. "I told you. I wanted to apologize." James leaned back slightly, studying the young man across from him. "You already did that back at the bank." Ethan exhaled, his fingers tightening around the ceramic cup. "That was different. Back there, I was apologizing because I had to. Because your son demanded it. But this is because I need to." James didn't respond right away. Instead, he took another sip of his tea, his expression unreadable. Ethan swallowed hard before continuing. "Look, I grew up thinking that money looked a certain way. That the people who walked into a bank wearing designer suits and driving expensive cars were the only ones worth taking seriously. When I saw you walk in that day, I didn't see a customer. I saw someone wasting my time." He let out a humorless chuckle. "Turns out, I was the one who was wasting an opportunity to be decent." James set his cup down. "You regret what you did?" Ethan nodded. "More than I can put into words." James folded his hands on the table. "And what have you learned?" Ethan blinked, caught off guard by the question. He hesitated, then let out a slow breath. "I've learned that respect shouldn't come with conditions. That wealth isn't always something you can see. And that sometimes, the people we overlook are the ones with the most to teach us." A small smile tugged at the corner of James's lips. "Not bad, kid." Ethan exhaled in relief. "Does that mean you forgive me?" James studied him for a moment before giving a slow nod. "Yeah, I do." Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. But before he could fully relax, James leaned forward slightly, his sharp eyes locking onto Ethan's. "But forgiveness isn't the same as forgetting," James said. "What matters now is what you do with this lesson. Because an apology is just words. What comes next, that's what defines a person." Ethan nodded solemnly. "I won't forget." James watched him for another beat before finally leaning back in his chair. "Good." The two sat in silence for a few moments, sipping their tea. The tension that had lingered between them began to ease, replaced by something that resembled understanding. Then, Ethan cleared his throat. "Can I ask you something?" James raised an eyebrow. "You just did." Ethan huffed a quiet laugh. "Right. Well, another question, then." He hesitated. "Why didn't you ever deposit your money before?" James's expression grew thoughtful. "I never trusted banks much," he admitted. "I grew up during a time when people lost everything because they put their faith in the wrong places. So I kept my savings close. Made sure I had control over it." Ethan nodded, understanding. "But you changed your mind?" James smiled faintly. "Eventually. I'm getting older. Figured it was time to put it somewhere safe. Not for me, but for the people I care about." Ethan studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Makes sense." Another pause. Then, to Ethan's surprise, James smirked slightly. "Though I have to say, kid, you and your coworkers didn't exactly do much to help build my trust in banks." Ethan let out an embarrassed groan, rubbing a hand over his face. "Yeah, that's fair." James chuckled. "At least you're honest." Ethan took another sip of his tea before setting the cup down. He looked at James, sincerity in his eyes. "For what it's worth, I want to do better. Not just with you, but with everyone." James nodded approvingly. "That's a good start." Meanwhile, at Grand Trust Bank. As Ethan sat in James's apartment, back at Grand Trust Bank, the fallout from the viral story was still unfolding. Corporate executives had flown in for emergency meetings. Richard Coleman, the branch manager, had been called into a conference room, where he now sat across from 2 senior executives from headquarters. "This situation has brought a lot of negative attention to our bank," One of the executives, a stern-looking woman in her 50s, said. And to be frank, Richard, your handling of it was problematic. Richard sat stiffly, hands clasped in front of him. I understand that, ma'am. The other executive, a sharp-eyed man in his 60s, tapped his fingers against the table. The board is considering disciplinary action. Richard's throat went dry. Sir, with all due respect, we're not firing you, the man interrupted. But you will be formally reprimanded. And effective immediately, you are being transferred to a different branch. A lower traffic location. Richard swallowed hard. A demotion. The woman across from him continued. Furthermore, we are implementing mandatory sensitivity and customer service training across all Grand Trust Bank branches. We can't afford another incident like this. Richard nodded stiffly. He had no choice but to accept his fate. And as the meeting concluded, he realized that James Anderson had walked into his bank with a bag full of money, but had left behind a lesson worth far more than any dollar amount. The final lesson. Later that night, after Ethan had left James's apartment, James sat alone at his table, staring out the window at the city lights. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. This time, when he opened it, he found Michael standing there. Hey, Dad, Michael greeted, stepping inside. He held up a newspaper. Looks like you're famous. James sighed, shaking his head as he took the paper from him. The front page featured a photo of James at the bank, standing in front of the stacks of cash. The headline read, A Billionaire's Father Teaches the World a Lesson on Respect. James set the newspaper down and chuckled. I didn't mean for all this to happen. Michael smirked. That's what makes it even better. James shook his head. I just wanted to put my money somewhere safe. Michael's expression softened. Well, you did a lot more than that. James looked at him, then at the newspaper. After a long moment, he let out a slow, thoughtful breath. Maybe. Outside, the city buzzed with life, unaware that within one small apartment, a lesson had been learned. And for James Anderson, that was enough. The news of James Anderson's story had reached beyond Grand Trust Bank. What started as a viral post on social media had now become a national conversation. Talk shows, financial analysts, and everyday people were all discussing the same question. How often do we judge people based on appearance alone? Television commentators debated the implications. This is exactly what's wrong with society, one anchor declared. We place too much value on status symbols, expensive clothes, luxury cars, and we fail to recognize true worth when it's right in front of us. A psychologist appearing on another network chimed in. The phenomenon is called implicit bias. We unconsciously associate wealth with competence and poverty with incompetence. What happened to Mr. Anderson is a perfect example of how dangerous those assumptions can be. On social media, thousands of users shared personal stories of times they had been judged unfairly. Some were tales of being dismissed at luxury stores, others of being ignored in professional settings simply because they didn't fit the expected mold. For Grand Trust Bank, the PR nightmare was far from over. The bank CEO was forced to make a public statement, acknowledging the mistakes made at the local branch. We deeply regret the way Mr. Anderson was treated. As a company, we are committed to ensuring that every customer, regardless of background or appearance, is treated with the dignity and respect they deserve. Despite the apology, customers began closing their accounts. Trust had been broken. One particularly damaging video surfaced. A customer had recorded herself cutting up her Grand Trust Bank credit card with a pair of scissors. The caption read, If they can treat a millionaire like this, imagine how they'd treat the rest of us. The video quickly amassed millions of views. The board of directors knew they had to act fast. Within days, Richard Coleman, the branch manager, was officially removed from his position. While the bank didn't fire him outright, his career had taken a permanent hit. Inside the branch, employees were walking on eggshells. Many of them had played a role in dismissing James Anderson. Now, they were being watched. One thing was clear, things would never be the same. Ethan's second chance. While the world continued discussing the story, Ethan Miller was on a journey of his own. His visit to James Anderson's apartment had been eye-opening. The conversation they'd had, the forgiveness James had offered, it stuck with him. And for the first time in his career, Ethan truly wanted to be better. When he returned to work, he took a different approach. Instead of rushing customers through transactions, he made an effort to listen. Instead of judging people based on their appearance, He reminded himself that everyone had a story. It wasn't long before people noticed the change. One afternoon, an elderly woman came to Ethan's counter. She was struggling to understand an online banking issue. Before, Ethan would have sighed impatiently and passed her off to someone else. But now he took his time. He walked her through the process, step by step, making sure she understood. When she finally smiled in relief and thanked him, something inside him clicked. This was what his job was supposed to be about. Later that day, David Carter, the young teller who had defended James from the beginning, approached Ethan. "You've been different lately," David noted, leaning against the counter. Ethan glanced at him, then shrugged. "I guess I've been doing some thinking." David smirked. "Good. We could use more of that around here." Ethan exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "I screwed up big time, David. I don't know if I can fix it." David studied him for a moment. "Maybe not, but trying is a good place to start." Ethan nodded. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was moving in the right direction. James and Michael, a father and son's reflection. Meanwhile, James Anderson had returned to his normal life. Despite his newfound viral fame, he wanted no part of the attention. He had never been a man who sought recognition. But one thing had changed. His son, Michael, had been calling more often, checking in, taking him out for dinner. One evening, as they sat at a quiet restaurant, Michael sighed and set down his fork. "I've been thinking about something." James raised an eyebrow. "That's never a good sign." Michael chuckled before growing serious. "You know, for most of my life, I thought I knew what success looked like." He gestured vaguely. Big offices, expensive suits, private jets. James took a sip of his coffee. "And now?" Michael smiled faintly. "Now I realize success can look a lot like an old man who saved every penny he ever made, who never let pride or greed change him." He shook his head. "Dad, you've taught me more in the past few weeks than I learned in my entire career." James smirked. "Took you long enough." Michael laughed, shaking his head. Yeah. Guess I had to see it for myself." James leaned back in his chair, watching his son. "And what are you going to do with that lesson?" Michael met his gaze. "Make sure I don't forget it." The two men sat in comfortable silence, the weight of the past few weeks settling between them. For James, life had always been simple. Work hard, save what you can, treat people the way you want to be treated. And now, it seemed, the world was finally starting to understand. The unexpected letter. A few days later, as James was sipping his morning coffee, a letter arrived at his apartment. It was from Grand Trust Bank. Curious, he opened it and unfolded the crisp piece of paper inside. "Dear Mr. Anderson, on behalf of Grand Trust Bank, I want to extend my sincerest apologies for the way you were treated at our branch. Your story has sparked an important conversation, one that we at the highest levels of leadership are taking seriously. As a token of our commitment to change, we are making a $500,000 donation to a charity of your choosing, in your name. We hope this action serves as a step toward rebuilding trust, not just with you, but with every customer who walks through our doors. Thank you for reminding us of a lesson we should never have forgotten. Sincerely, Margaret Holloway, CEO, Grand Trust Bank." James read the letter twice, then let out a small chuckle. "Well, I'll be damned." He set the letter aside, shaking his head with amusement. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had never wanted their money. He just wanted respect. Still, he'd make sure that money went to a good cause. As he reached for his coffee, he thought about all the lives that had been changed because of one afternoon at a bank. One man's quiet patience had exposed a flawed system. One moment of judgment had turned into a nationwide discussion. And one lesson had been learned. The way you treat people, no matter who they are, always matters. The letter from Grand Trust Bank sat on James Anderson's small kitchen table, neatly folded beside his coffee cup. He had read it more times than he cared to admit, yet each time, he shook his head with the same quiet amusement. A $500,000 donation to a charity of his choice. Michael had been the first to see the letter when he stopped by that afternoon. "Guess they're trying to clean up their image," he had said, handing it back to his father. James had merely chuckled. "A little late for that, don't you think?" Michael had smirked. Better late than never. That evening, James sat down at his old wooden desk with a pen in hand. He knew exactly where the money should go. The announcement that shocked everyone. 2 days later, a press release was issued from Grand Trust Bank. It detailed their continued efforts toward customer service reform, and included a headline that immediately went viral. James Anderson donates $500,000 to low-income scholarship fund for trade workers. The response was overwhelming. For decades, James had worked blue-collar jobs, construction, plumbing, janitorial work, doing whatever was needed to get by. He had saved every penny from those jobs, knowing what it was like to struggle. So, when it came time to choose where the bank's donation would go, the answer had been obvious. College isn't for everyone, James had told a reporter when asked about his decision. But hard work should always be rewarded. If this money can help young people learn a trade and build a future for themselves, then that's where it belongs. The news spread like wildfire. National trade unions praised the decision, highlighting how skilled labor jobs were often overlooked despite their importance. A well-known radio host commented, "This man didn't just teach a lesson about respect. He's making real change happen." For many, James Anderson wasn't just an old man who had saved his money. He had become a symbol, a reminder that wealth wasn't always flashy, and success didn't always come in the form of designer suits and corporate titles. Ethan Miller's unexpected journey. Meanwhile, back at Grand Trust Bank, Ethan Miller was still grappling with the aftermath of everything that had happened. The national backlash against the bank had settled somewhat, but inside the branch, the shift was palpable. Employees were suddenly hyper-aware of how they treated customers, their attitudes more patient, their greetings more sincere. And Ethan? He had taken James's words to heart. Every morning before his shift, he would stop at a nearby cafe, order a coffee, and sit by the window, observing the world with new eyes. He paid attention to the people most would ignore, the janitors cleaning the sidewalks, the elderly struggling with their grocery bags, the delivery workers rushing between stops. One morning, he found himself striking up a conversation with a sanitation worker who happened to be on his break. The man, named Carlos, had been on the job for 20 years. Carlos chuckled as he took a sip of his coffee. "You know, you're the first banker I've ever had a real conversation with." Ethan smiled sheepishly. "I guess I never thought to have one before." Carlos raised an eyebrow. What changed? Ethan thought about James Anderson, about the way he had misjudged a man who had worked harder than anyone he knew, about the way he had treated him as less than human, all because of how he looked. He exhaled. "Let's just say, I got a much-needed reality check." Carlos nodded knowingly. "Yeah, life has a way of humbling us like that." Ethan didn't argue. David Carter gets a call. Elsewhere, at the bank, David Carter, the young teller who had stood up for James from the beginning, was about to get the surprise of his career. Since the incident, David had been getting more attention from upper management. Some of the higher-ups at Grand Trust Bank had recognized that he was the only employee who had done the right thing from the start. So, when his phone rang one afternoon and the caller introduced themselves as Margaret Holloway, the CEO of Grand Trust Bank, he nearly dropped his pen. "David," she said, her voice calm yet commanding, "I wanted to personally commend you for your actions regarding Mr. Anderson." David straightened in his chair. "I was just doing what I thought was right, ma'am." "That's exactly why I'm calling," she said. "We need more people like you in leadership positions. How would you feel about moving into management training?" David's jaw nearly hit the desk. "Ma'am, are you serious?" Margaret Holloway chuckled. "Completely." David couldn't believe it. A week ago, he had been a low-level teller. Now, because he had chosen to stand by what was right, his entire career was about to change. And deep down, he knew exactly who he had to thank for that. A simple life, a powerful legacy. 1 week later, James sat in his usual diner, sipping a cup of coffee as he read through the newspaper. The buzz around his story had finally begun to settle, but he still couldn't go a day without someone recognizing him. "Mr. Anderson?" James looked up to see a young man standing by his table, looking nervous. He was dressed in work boots and a well-worn mechanic's uniform, his hands still covered in grease. "Can I help you?" James asked. The young man shifted awkwardly. I wanted to say thank you." James frowned slightly. "For what?" "For the trade scholarship," the man explained. "I've been trying to save up for school for years, but it was never enough. Now, because of you, I can finally afford to get my certification." James stared at him for a long moment before a slow smile spread across his face. He reached out and patted the young man's arm. "Well then," James said, "make the most of it." The young man grinned. "I will, sir. I promise." As he walked away, James felt a deep sense of satisfaction settle in his chest. He had never needed recognition, never wanted fame, but knowing that his actions had made a real difference, that was something worth smiling about. A lesson that would last. Later that evening, Michael called his father. "You know," Michael said, "this whole thing started because you just wanted to deposit your savings." James chuckled. "Life's funny like that." Michael smirked. "So what's next? You gonna walk into another bank and see who else you can teach a lesson?" James laughed. "I think I've done enough teaching for now." Michael smiled. "I wouldn't be so sure about that." As the two continued their conversation, James glanced at the small pile of letters on his kitchen table, thank you notes from students, business owners, and even strangers who had been moved by his story. One small action, one moment of patience, had changed lives. And for James Anderson, that was more than enough. James Anderson never considered himself a man of great importance. He had never sought recognition, never craved the spotlight. Yet, here he was, sitting in his modest apartment, surrounded by letters from strangers, students, workers, and even corporate executives, all thanking him for a lesson he had never intended to teach. The world had moved on, as it always did, but the impact of his story still rippled outward. The donation he had made to the trade school fund was already changing lives. Grand Trust Bank had restructured its policies, ensuring that employees were properly trained to treat every customer with dignity, regardless of their appearance. And Ethan Miller, the teller who had once dismissed James as nothing more than a waste of time, had transformed into a different man altogether. A new beginning for Ethan Miller. One crisp morning, Ethan stood outside a small community center, gripping a cup of coffee in one hand and a stack of volunteer forms in the other. He had spent the past few months searching for ways to give back, to prove, to himself more than anyone, that he had changed. His meeting with James had shaken something loose inside him, forcing him to confront the person he had been. He couldn't undo his past mistakes, but he could choose to be better moving forward. The community center had a mentorship program for young people struggling to find direction. Some had dropped out of school. Others had aged out of foster care. Many just needed someone to believe in them. Ethan wasn't sure he was qualified for this kind of work, but he knew one thing. Everyone deserved a chance, just as James Anderson had deserved one. As he stepped inside the building, he felt a sense of nervous excitement. Maybe this was where his real work began. David Carter's rise in the banking world. Meanwhile, back at Grand Trust Bank, David Carter was settling into his new role. After receiving the unexpected call from CEO Margaret Holloway, David had been enrolled in a management training program. Unlike most corporate fast tracks, this one had a clear focus: customer relations, ethics, and leadership. David thrived. In his first week, he implemented a new initiative, one that encouraged employees to take the time to truly listen to their customers, no matter how they looked or how much money they had. It was a simple concept. Yet, in the world of high-speed banking, where efficiency often came before empathy, it changed everything. The executives took notice. 6 months later, David received a promotion, assistant branch manager. It wasn't just a title. It was proof that standing up for what was right mattered. And he owed it all to a man who had walked into the bank with nothing but a bag of cash and a quiet sense of dignity. Michael Anderson's realization. Across town, Michael Anderson was also feeling the effects of his father's unexpected legacy. As CEO of Anderson Enterprises, Michael had spent years focused on growth, profits, and expansion. His company was a leader in real estate, known for building luxury high-rises and high-end commercial developments. But after watching his father's story unfold, something shifted in him. For the first time, he began to wonder, what was his success really built on? One evening, he invited his father to his office, a sleek, modern skyscraper with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. James stepped inside, taking in the minimalist decor and pristine furniture. He let out a low whistle. "Fancy place." Michael smirked. "It gets the job done." James took a seat across from his son's massive desk. "So, what's this about?" Michael leaned forward. "I want to do something different, Dad." James raised an eyebrow. "Different how?" Michael exhaled, drumming his fingers against the desk. "I've spent years building this company, but it's always been about profit, about building for the wealthiest clients." He hesitated. "But that's not enough anymore." James tilted his head, intrigued. "Go on." Michael met his father's gaze. "I want to start a project, affordable housing." Real, sustainable homes for working-class families. People like you. Like how we used to be. James studied his son carefully. That's a big shift. Michael nodded. It is. And it won't be the most profitable venture we've ever done. But it'll be the right thing to do. A slow smile spread across James's face. Now that, he said, is something I can get behind. A quiet life, a powerful legacy. As the months passed, James's life remained as simple as ever. He still took the same walks around his neighborhood. Still stopped by the same diner for his morning coffee. But now, people recognized him. A young woman working the cash register at a local grocery store hesitated when she rang up his order one afternoon. "Mr. Anderson?" she asked tentatively. James looked up, surprised. "That's me." She smiled shyly. "I just wanted to say thank you. My brother. He's one of the students who got a scholarship from your donation. He's studying to become an electrician now." James blinked. "That's so?" She nodded. "Yeah, and it's all because of you." James waved a dismissive hand. "Nah, it's because of him. I just made sure he had the chance." The young woman beamed. "Well, thank you anyway." As James walked out of the store, he let out a slow, thoughtful breath. He had never needed recognition, never cared about status, but knowing that his actions had changed lives, that meant something. The final reflection. One evening, as the sun set over the city, James sat on his small apartment balcony, a cup of tea in hand. Michael had called earlier, excited about the progress of his new affordable housing project. Ethan had sent him a letter, detailing his work at the community center. David had left a voicemail, thanking him once again for that one small moment in the bank that had changed everything. James smiled to himself. He had walked into Grand Trust Bank that day with no expectations. He had simply wanted to deposit his life savings. Instead, he had started a movement. And all because of a simple truth. The way you treat people will always matter. As he took a sip of his tea, he let out a contented sigh. A life well earned. A lesson well taught. And for James Anderson, that was more than enough. A year had passed since James Anderson's unforgettable visit to Grand Trust Bank. Life had settled into its usual rhythm, though nothing was quite the same. The impact of that day had rippled far beyond what anyone could have imagined. James still lived in his modest apartment, still took his daily walks, and still preferred his quiet, simple life over any newfound attention. But the world around him had changed in ways he never expected. The bank that learned its lesson. At Grand Trust Bank, the branch where everything had unfolded was barely recognizable. Under new management, the culture had shifted dramatically. Employees were no longer trained just on policy and efficiency. They were trained on dignity and respect. A customer-first initiative had been implemented across all branches. Bankers were encouraged to treat every person who walked through the doors as if they were a valued client, regardless of their appearance or how much money they had in their account. Ethan Miller, who had once dismissed James without a second thought, had fully embraced his second chance. Now, whenever a customer approached his counter, he made a conscious effort to listen, to see them as a person rather than just a transaction. One afternoon, an elderly man with shaky hands placed a small pile of wrinkled dollar bills on Ethan's counter. The man's clothes were worn, his shoes barely holding together. A year ago, Ethan might have sighed impatiently, might have barely looked at him before rushing him through the process. But now, he smiled warmly and took his time, counting each bill carefully. When he finished, he met the man's gaze and said, "Is there anything else I can do for you today, sir?" The old man blinked in surprise. Then, slowly he smiled. David Carter's new mission. Meanwhile, David Carter had fully stepped into his role as assistant branch manager, though his true passion had evolved into something much greater. After everything that had happened, David had begun advocating for better banking access for low-income communities. He had partnered with local organizations, setting up financial literacy workshops to help people learn about savings, investments, and responsible money management. One evening, after finishing a workshop at a community center, David received a phone call. "Mr. Carter?" "Yes, this is David." "This is Margaret Holloway. I wanted to personally congratulate you." David's heart skipped a beat. The CEO of Grand Trust Bank was calling him directly? "We've been reviewing your work," Margaret continued, "and we'd like to offer you a position at our corporate headquarters. We need people like you leading the future of this company." David leaned against the wall, momentarily stunned. He had started as a low-level teller, simply doing what he believed was right. Now, He was being offered a leadership role at the highest level, all because he had chosen integrity over indifference. Michael Anderson's greatest project yet. Across the city, Michael Anderson's affordable housing project had broken ground. It wasn't the most profitable venture his company had ever undertaken, but it was the one he was most proud of. For years, his company had catered to the elite, building high-rise apartments with luxury amenities. But now, he was building homes for the working class. One afternoon, as he visited the construction site, his phone rang. "Hey, Dad," Michael greeted, putting his hard hat under his arm. "How's it coming along?" James asked. Michael looked out at the half-finished houses, at the workers moving diligently to bring his vision to life. "It's coming along," he said. "Slowly, but it'll be worth it." James chuckled. "Patience pays off. I should know." Michael smiled. "Yeah, Dad, you definitely should." A visit to the bank, full circle. One bright afternoon, James decided to take a familiar walk to Grand Trust Bank. This time, he wasn't carrying a heavy canvas bag. This time, when he stepped through the doors, the entire staff stood a little taller, smiled a little wider. The new branch manager, a woman named Linda Park, spotted him first. "Mr. Anderson," she greeted warmly. "It's good to see you." James nodded. "Good to be back." Ethan Miller, now one of the most respected tellers in the branch, made his way over. "Mr. Anderson," he said, his voice full of sincerity. "It's nice to see you again." James smirked. "No more kicking me out." Ethan chuckled, slightly embarrassed. "Never again." Linda led James to her office, offering him a seat. "I have something for you," she said, pulling out a small plaque from behind her desk. James frowned. "What's this?" Linda placed the plaque in front of him. It was made of polished wood, with a brass plate engraved with the words, "The James Anderson Customer Respect Policy." Underneath, in smaller letters, was the inscription, a reminder that dignity has no price tag. Every customer matters. James stared at it for a long moment. "Corporate approved it last month," Linda explained. "Every branch now follows this policy. It's company-wide." James ran a weathered hand over the plaque, a slow smile forming on his face. "Well," he said finally, "would you look at that?" A lesson passed down. That evening, James sat in his apartment, a cup of tea in hand, the plaque resting on his small kitchen table. His phone buzzed. It was Michael. "Hey, Dad," Michael greeted. "Did you go to the bank today?" "I did," James said. Michael hesitated. "How was it?" James chuckled. "A hell of a lot better than last time." Michael laughed. "Glad to hear it." Then, after a pause, he said, "You know, I never asked. Why didn't you ever tell people about the money you had? Why live so simple when you could have had more?" James thought for a moment, then answered, "Because having more doesn't make you more. And sometimes, when people think you have nothing, they show you who they really are." Michael was silent for a moment. Then he let out a small breath. "You really are one of a kind, Dad." James smirked. "Took you long enough to figure that out." They both laughed, their voices warm with familiarity. As the call ended, James leaned back in his chair, taking in the quiet peace of the evening. He had never needed fame, never sought wealth for its own sake. All he had ever wanted was to live with integrity. And in doing so, he had changed countless lives. The lesson he had taught, that respect and dignity should never be measured by appearances, would live on long after he was gone. A simple truth, a powerful legacy. And for James Anderson, that was more than enough.